No other biblical book has inspired social justice warriors across the ages as the book of Isaiah. It's only fitting that we should take up the story behind the man and try to get a sense of what made his poetry and prose stand out among all the literature ever composed. Who was this prophet Isaiah? And what ageless messages does he still convey to human society? Surprisingly little is known about him, including his actual profession or occupation. But here's what we do know. He was married, perhaps to a female prophet, and he came from a well-to-do family of royal lineage in ancient Judea. Nevertheless, his pedigree couldn't isolate him from the troubles of his day and age. The year is 742 BCE, and King Uzziah, who was sitting on David's throne in Jerusalem, has just died. A new king, Ahaz, sponsors the worship of pagan deities alongside the God of Israel. Isaiah may be an upper-class patrician, but he has great sympathy for the ordinary folk, and he cares deeply for the impoverished people of the land. On one occasion, when he is in the great temple of Jerusalem, said to have been built by the illustrious King Solomon, he has an overwhelming vision. Bishnat mot melech Uziyahu, ve'er'e et Adoshem, yoshev al kisei, ram v'nisa, ve'shulav maleim et ha'echal, tzrafim omdim mema'al lo, שש כנפיים לאחד, בשתיים יחסי פניו, ובשתיים יחסי רגליו, ובשתיים יעופף, וקרא זה אל זה ואמר, קדוש, 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 השם צבאות, מלוא כל הארץ כבודו. There's no clearer exposition of ethical monotheism than this. The Hebrew word kadosh, holy, doesn't mean what people today think it means, that is, moral excellence. It means radically separate, or in philosophical terms, other. We can just as well translate the serifs as crying, other, other, other. The gods of Israel's neighbors, Baal, Marduk, and Dagon, may have presided in temples of their own, but this God is different. This is no longer the God who walked with Adam in the Garden of Eden, or who, with two angels, sat and schmoozed with Abraham in his tent. German-born Israeli philosopher and historian Gershom Scholem referred to a primitive stage in Israel's God concept, followed by a creative stage in which God is viewed as being utterly removed from and sitting above the material world. This deity is completely different from any other god or goddess ever imagined in the pagan world. This was not a god of nature. This God controls nature, judging the world and all of humanity, and that is an essential prerequisite for social justice. You have to appeal to something above and beyond human society in order to be able to criticize it and demand reform. In Isaiah's case, that something is his God. Of course, that otherness also means there's a huge chasm between humankind and the divine realm, which also happens to be the message of Moses at Mount Sinai. Everything about that narrative, the thunder and lightning, the fear and trembling, and the denial of Moses' appeal even to look on God's face, is a statement of the creative stage. of the radical separation and otherness of Israelite monotheism. No one can see this God, and that's why we shouldn't take Isaiah's vision too literally. It would take a third stage in the development of monotheism, the mystical stage, for later generations of Jewish sages to try to find their way back to a kind of primitive intimacy with the divine, while not jettisoning monotheism itself. That struggle would give birth, centuries later, to what is called today Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. But in Isaiah's day, God would remain sufficiently distant to inspire terror. This is a far cry from Buddhism or other Eastern religions, where the hallmark of true enlightenment is harmony and tranquil bliss brought about by a series of spiritual exercises. Isaiah's response to his terrifying vision sums it up. He literally says, "Oi! Oi li, ki nidmeti, ki ish tamei sfatayim anochi, uvetoch am tamei sfatayim anochi yoshev, ki et hamelech Hashem tzvaot ra'u einai." Isaiah, like other biblical prophets, going back to Moses, was an unwilling recruit in divine service. One of the seraphs purifies the prophet's lips with a live coal so that he can pronounce his oracles. It's been argued that the prophets did nothing less than transform the vengeful warrior God of the Exodus into a transcendent emblem of compassion, power, and justice. But that shift in how Israel's monotheistic deity would forever be perceived would be accompanied by struggle, pain, and anguish. Despite God's radical otherness, Isaiah will describe the deity in anthropomorphic terms. This God can be approached as a person, reasoned with, even argued with. This is a world apart from the religions of the East. Hinduism, for example, depicts Brahman as the world soul or cosmic soul. It is the eternal essence of the universe, but can't be interacted with on a human level. Having a dialogue with Brahman is unthinkable. Israel's God, by contrast, speaks to the prophet, and the prophet can respond. God asks, "Et mi eshlach?" And Isaiah answers, like Abraham of old, "Hineni shlacheni." Isaiah's charge isn't to become spiritually enlightened, as in Buddhism, but to do something, to take action. And that's the Jewish element. It's also the social justice element. But the prophet shouldn't expect that the message will be accepted. God tells him, "Lech v'amarta le'am hazeh, shim'u shamoa v'al tavinu, u'ra'u ra'o v'al teda'u." Isaiah doesn't focus solely on societal ills. He's influential enough to have the ear of the king, and his words are politically charged. The northern kingdom, with its 10 tribes, collapses in the year 722 BCE, and Assyria takes its people into captivity. They will never be heard from again. Now, the southern kingdom of Judah is under threat from Assyria's growing empire. Isaiah thunders a stern warning. "V'ha'adama tisha'eh shmama, v'richak Hashem et ha'adam, v'rabba ha'azuva bekerev ha'aretz, ve'od ba Assyria, ve'shava v'hayta leva'er, ka'ela v'ha'alon, asher b'shalechet matzevet bam, zera kodesh matzavta." It didn't take a clairvoyant with a crystal ball to figure this out. The revolutionary thing here is how Isaiah analyzes these events. Back in the days of the Exodus from Egypt, enemies were enemies, and there was no question whose side Israel's God was on. Now, God is actually driving Assyria against his own people because they have not been faithful to the covenant. The prophet has turned traditional religious thought on its head. This is nothing short of a quantum leap in the evolution of ethical monotheism. This deity may be completely other, but nonetheless acts in human affairs, not on a whim, like the fickle pagan deities of the nations round about, but to bring about divine justice, and that includes social justice. This is not the God of mythology, but the ruler of history. It's a directional history that had a beginning, that has a definitive end in a messianic age, which the prophets would call the day of the Lord, with many vicissitudes, ups and downs, trials and tribulations along the way. It's a progression, and it's been argued that the very word progress is essentially a Jewish word. Assyria is just a tool in the hands of the Almighty to chastise the covenant people. But since the Assyrians have no such covenant, they will be destroyed in turn. That meant there would be a future hope for the chastened Israelites. Still, Isaiah's audience hardly cheered the message that Israel had itself brought catastrophe. So God was behind the devastating Assyrian campaign, just as he had been behind the great biblical heroes of the past, Moses, Joshua, and David? Has God lost his divine mind? The God of Moses was a triumphalist. Isaiah's God, by contrast, was full of sorrow. Isaiah begins his book with a broadside against the sacrifice and the temple itself. Yada ish koneu, v'chamor evus ba'alav. Yisrael lo yada ami, lo hitbonan. Lama li rov zivchechem, yomar Hashem. Savati olot ayalim, v'chelev meriim, v'dam parim, ukvasim, v'atudim lo chafatzti. Lo tosifu havi minchat shav, ketoret toeva hi li, chodesh v'shabbat, karo mikra, lo uchal aven ve'atzara. His audience would have been in shock, especially since cultic rituals were the heart of ancient Near Eastern religion. Pagan deities relied on these rituals to restore their diminished energies. Isaiah was denouncing all such ceremony as completely worthless. It's the inner meaning of ritual that counts. And not a few modern critics are of the opinion that the Israelite prophets of the 8th century BCE completely dismissed animal sacrifice. But are they going too far? Are they making unwarranted assumptions? 20th century Jewish philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel said, "Not so fast." One cannot doubt the sacred authority of the cult. It had a place and a procedure of its own, a sacred nimbus, a mysterious glory. The sacrificial act was a form of personal association with God, a way of entering into communion with Him. In offering an animal, a person was offering himself vicariously. It had the power of atonement. The sanctuary was holiness in perpetuity, a miracle in continuity. The divine was mirrored in the air, sowing blessing, closing gaps between the here and the beyond. In offering a sacrifice, man mingled with mystery, reached the summit of significance. Sin was consumed, self abandoned. Satisfaction was bestowed upon divinity. Is it possible for us to conceive of the solemn joy of those whose offering was placed on the altar? Heschel comes around to Kaufmann's position that what we've got here isn't a radical rejection of the temple cult, only of its abuse. In that case, we really are talking about a war on idolatry, and the idea that social justice flows from that. Put another way, God doesn't reject the offerings themselves, but the notion that blood on the hands of murderers can be washed clean by them.
ובפרשכם כפיכם, אעלים עיניים מכם, גם כי תרבו תפילה אינני שומע, ידיכם דמים מלאו.
But whether or not Isaiah would have done away with sacrifices, he insisted, just as the prophet Hosea, that God doesn't want sacrifice, but compassion. Like all social justice warriors, Isaiah points a finger not at outsiders, but at his own people. And such self-criticism has become the hallmark of Western civilization to this day. And like Hosea, he declares,
איכה הייתה לזונה קריה נאמנה.
He goes on,
בנות ציון ותלכנה נטויות גרון ומקשרות עיניים.
Like Amos, he castigates the ruling class, seeing that the property of small landholders has been unjustly expropriated. For crimes perpetrated under the cover of judicial corruption, Isaiah appeals to the God of Israel.
ניצב לרוב השם ועומד לדין עמים.
So, was social reform the primary concern of Isaiah and the other prophets? Or was Max Weber right in arguing that social reform was only a means to an end? And what, pray tell, was the end? Fidelity to Israel's God, of course. Everything else, including social justice, was secondary. Not surprisingly, there's no way to reconcile these conflicting viewpoints. Somebody's right and somebody's wrong. And the rest is history.